Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review The Alchemist's Euphoria by Kasabian. This is the brand new album of UK alternative dance group Kasabian, which comes out almost 5 years after their previous work. Now when it comes to Kasabian, in my opinion, they have a pretty strong debut. The self-titled album had some pretty cool tracks. I recognized some of them beforehand from playing in the radio, but the overall consistent vibes out of this album had a pretty strong 2000s feel that in my opinion was executed in a really nice way. So for me the debut album was not necessarily something that much exceptional, but it was a really good album for what it offered. Now even if the albums afterwards never really managed to reach that point of quality, they were still not that bad. There were still some pretty decent tracks and I enjoyed them as albums. Now I haven't heard their entire catalog. There are a few spots with some albums that I haven't listened to yet, but from everything I've heard so far with their latest works, they didn't really seem to sound that bad. Even their previous album, For Crying Out Loud, had in my opinion some really good spots, had some highlights and tracks that I thought were enjoyable. So it is actually kinda shocking over here how much of a downgrade this album is in terms of quality. And in basically everything, this is by far the worst album that I've heard from Kasabian ever. Now like I said, even if I haven't heard the entire catalog, I doubt that anything else that they have is as bad as this album. Like we're talking about a massive downgrade over here, with actually one of the worst albums that I've heard this year so far. Now as far as we still have an alternative dance album over here, it seems that there have been some really drastic changes when it comes to their sound and the overall style that they're going for. First of all, we have a change up when it comes to the vocalist, since the main vocalist has departed from the band from 2020, and so the vocals over here are done from another member of the group. Now I find the vocals over here with this album to be extremely bad. Like I never really cared that much about the vocals of Kasabian, but in this album they truly do stink, they do sound awful. But I don't necessarily think that this has that much to do with the performances or the vocal abilities of the singer. It mostly has to do with how insufferable this whole mixing is, and this is an issue that doesn't really come that much with just the vocals, but with this entire album. When it comes to the mixing, we're talking about a pretty obnoxious and at sometimes insufferable album. Everything over here sounds overblown, overcompressed, and it's just over the top to the point where it just sounds really annoying and it doesn't really seem to make that much of a sense why everything just seems to be so loud. Like yeah, I never remember that being that much of the case with the previous Kasabian albums. They were known for having really powerful and dynamic moments, but the mixing has never felt this messy before, and we're talking about an awful choice of sounds as well, especially when it comes to some of the synths which sound really awful over here. Not only are they mostly really loud into the mix, but they do sound quite awful. Like the overall choice of sounds, it's really bad, and it's something that also happens with the vocals, as they're quite robotic and are filled with all of those effects that just sound really awful. You have moments of like intense auto-tune, you have other moments where you have some vocal manipulations that don't really make any sense, and it's just pretty annoying. And yeah, it might make sense for like an alternative dance album, but I believe that it's just executed poorly in any regard. It just sounds quite embarrassing, and I had a really hard time to pick positives in some of those occasions. Now you have the introduction, Alchemist, which is a track which already shows some signs of poor mixing when it ends up sounding much more intense in the second half, and it just ends up sounding like really awful in its attempt to try to be epic or like really dynamic. Then you have tracks like SCRIPTVRE, which when it comes to its overall structure and the way it sounds, it's just a really basic and bland song that just happens to be too much in your face, to the point where it just becomes like really messy and hard to decipher what's really going on. It's a poorly mixed song, and it's not even that there are ideas over here that manage to be compelling or all that engaging. So there is really nothing with tracks like this, and it goes for sort of the same path with tracks like Rocket Fuel, which contains some of the most awful synths out of this entire album, and there is also Strictly Old School, and with those tracks it basically goes into some similar directions of trying to be quite epic and intense, but managing at the end of the day to just sound really obnoxious and annoying. Then there is the track Alligator, which is more of the same, but this one has to be the worst in my opinion, especially when it comes to the vocals towards the chorus that are these obnoxious auto-tune vocals that sound really over the top, like really overbearing to the mix. They're just really irritating after a certain point. It is a track that is really shocking to me how this ends up being a Kasabian song first of all, and how it even managed to make the cut. Like, yeah, I really don't know what's with those tracks. Now, as we go forward with this album, with the second half, it ends up becoming a little bit more smooth, more chill, but this one simply applies to its ideas and instrumentation because the mixing is still pretty loud. You have the interlude space, which is basically just an ambient synth, and even this sound is actually kinda loud. Then there's the track The Wall, which is treated more of like a ballad. It is a much more smooth song, for the most part at least, but it's still really loud in its mixing. The ultraview effect is possibly the only track over here where I can say that there is a bit of a balance with the sounds and actually managing to have a bit of a cohesion to it. I also kinda like how you have this transition almost towards the end of the song. It is an abrupt transition, it doesn't really make that much sense, but I like some of the elements out of this song. I can't really say that this one was that much of an awful experience. It's just a bit forgettable as it's a really lengthy moment, and there are a few moments that I would say that sort of feel like filler at some occasions. I would say it's the same case with the Dragstar Gazer, which is another track that I would sort of consider highlight out of this album. I actually kinda like the way it starts with those distorted bass sounds. It seemed to have a bit of a potential, and I was actually expecting this track to go into something much more aggressive, but it doesn't really happen. I like how it's toned down a little bit, and it has a few more atmospheric elements that don't really work all that bad over here. It's once again though another case where I feel that the pacing is really slow, and after a certain point the track becomes slightly repetitive, and it's also one of the lengthiest moments over here. So at its best this album, it's just really forgettable. When it comes to the final tracks, we have Chemicals, which is another single that is done really poorly in my opinion, a track that in my opinion has really nothing special to offer. Then there's another interlude, and we finally close with a guitar ballad song, which I don't really believe it works that much with the context of the rest of the album. It feels kinda out of place as a finisher, and it's just really bland, it's forgettable, there is nothing special about it, and I'm just left with an album over here where at its best it's just really bland and forgettable. At its worst, we're talking about some of the worst mixing and sounds I've heard in an album this year. This album feels more of like an experiment and a failed one. I don't really know how they're going to continue after this. I was just really disappointed with this album. I didn't really expect something like this from Kasabian. This album has almost nothing of value to it. I'm gonna give the Alchemist's Euphoria a 3- out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.